And he's a really interesting guy. I know him through his postings on David Farber's Interesting People list. Lauren always has something interesting to say about privacy or internet governance or open internet. He's a member of PFIR, People for Internet Responsibility, the Open Internet Consortium, for which I'm screwing up the acronym for, but we'll talk about that later, for making sure that people share internet well. He's worked on the Privacy Forum and all sorts of interesting things. And lots of reporters call him to ask him questions and his opinion on things.
I don't know why.
I don't know why either.
That's really.
But I've found that he always has interesting things to say, and he lives in, not too far from here. So I asked him to come in and just talk to us about something related to the stuff he does. And he's got, I don't know exactly what he has prepared, but he said it's something interesting. I love the title. He's called it Google and Empires.
Well, actually, it was Internet and Empires.
Internet and Empires. All right, I'm just thinking about
a little Freudian slip
Google
there.
And now, before I say something else I'll regret, here's Lauren.
Hi. Thank you. Thanks. And I figure I couldn't lose on this because of the free lunch. So that was easy from the start. I'm also very glad there's a wireless mic, because I'd been thinking earlier, I mean, people that have read my material and follow some of the stories and things I've been involved in know that from time to time I have been slightly critical of some Google policies. So if it was a hardwired mic, I was going to bring a tester to make sure it was grounded properly. But this will work out just fine. But that's really a good place to start, because there's a tendency in some quarters to look on people that are critical of some Google policies, and I separate policies from people. I think that's always a good starting point. As being, in the case of Google, either anti-Google or having a vendetta against Google or something like that. And that's really, really far from the truth. I mean, that's really the exact opposite of what's really going on, and why I have been critical in IP and in other places. In reality, my view is that the achievement of Google in particular is remarkable. It's a fantastic thing. The work that's done is incredible. And it's easy to forget that, it wasn't that many years ago that, children would have to go to libraries. They would have to actually look through books. Now there are kids growing up who don't know anything different than being able to just walk up to a computer in the bedroom or their cell phone or whatever and just get the answer to any question. Now, whether or not they get the right answer, that's a different matter and a little more complicated, but at least the facilities are there. At least the systems exist. And it's a long way. It's a long way in time, if not in miles, from where we started, and in ways that are very hard to have anticipated. So, back in the early 70s, when we were doing the early ARPANET work, which led to the internet and led to this room and your facilities up north and all of this, we really, in my opinion, didn't have any idea where this was leading. I spent God knows how many nights in a basement in Bolter Hall over there, just hacking code and I should have been doing more important things. Dating, for example, would have been a nice change back then. But in so many ways things have changed, and in so many ways things are the same. So back then we were working with big old honking mini computers from Digital Equipment Corporation, a company that was consumed by a company that itself no longer exists. And no one could have imagined back then that Digital Equipment could disappear. It seemed like IBM. And yet, in some ways, a lot of things haven't changed. Back then, we didn't have a standard I/O library in the early days. We used to have to do everything by hand. Now there's a standard I/O library. That's a big improvement. So many other tools. Yet we're still fighting things like buffer overruns. All the security problems associated with that. These are not rocket science kinds of problems, and yet they seem to be pretty difficult to deal with in the real world. But probably more important is that we didn't really think in terms of the work we were doing as having a lot of impact on society at large and on things that were non-technical. Now, it turns out we did in ways we didn't anticipate, and one of the reasons was that some of the tools that we built in that very closed ARPANET environment, you have to remember that it was a Defense Department funded project. If you screwed up, the Pentagon literally sent a colonel out to scream at you, to say you can't do this, that's inappropriate, that violates the acceptable use policies. I mean, people would get in trouble for starting a mailing list that discussed wine. And literally, that was a big deal back then. But some of the things that we deal with now, like spam, can, to a certain extent, be traced back to decisions that were made, and I remember the discussion groups back then, on mail protocols and mail systems and mail headers and what kind of identity you were going to have and what kind of authentication and all that. And we said, well, you don't really have, this is a closed environment. We know each other. If you screw up, you're going to get tossed off the net. Let's be open about this. Remember, it's the 70s. I mean, who's going to try to violate the trust in this? And if we had done it a little bit differently back then, there were things in retrospect we could have done. Of course, hindsight's always 20/20. That would have helped a lot. All right, so you fast forward those decades to now. And now all the work that's being done has an absolute, from day one, impact on the world. There's no escaping it. The internet is now part of everything. It has become the de facto telephone company, or will. Communications, information retrieval, information storage, all these things. And people are forced to use it whether they want to or not at this stage of the game. There's an example now going around of the Part D Medicare that's so botched up. And a lot of people didn't understand that because there was an assumption by the government that everyone was web literate and would be able to use those websites and learn all that, and a lot of people weren't. And there weren't enough phone reps to deal with it, and those people got lost in the shuffle, and some of them didn't get their insulin when they needed it, and ended up in the hospital. So these things really matter now. I mean, real lives are now being affected. And what's more, the kinds of decisions we make now in terms of infrastructures and in terms of information systems and all these, we're setting precedents and building infrastructures that are going to last for a long time in one respect or another. I mean, certain things change rapidly and certain things don't. The mindsets tend to change the slowest. So these decisions are absolutely critical now because we're going to have so much influence and so many forces that are going to be trying to influence these decisions. From governments, not necessarily US governments, for example. All these things are going to have tremendous impact. Google's slogan, right? So well known, do no evil. It's a very laudable goal. It's a wonderful thing. The problem is that doing no evil is really only the start, because there's so many forces, you don't want to be melodramatic about it, but that's really what's going on, that look on the wonders that you guys have built as their personal playground, their treasure chest, their way of doing what they want to do. And the fact that you don't want to do any evil probably isn't enough. One of my more flowery analogies that I use sometimes is an old sci-fi movie called Forbidden Planet. If you haven't seen it, it's worth digging out. It was made half a century ago. Walter Pidgeon and Anne Francis and Leslie Nielsen, before he figured out that the big money was in comedy, playing a serious role with a blaster. And in that movie we find out about this desolate planet far away that was laid waste by some kind of disaster millennia ago. And we learn from Morbius. He's a scientist who's been there for decades alone, just him and his daughter. We learn about this race that he's learned about through his researches. It was called the Krell. And they were almost gods by our standards. They were incredible intellects. They were totally benign, really, an unbelievably positive race that could do no wrong. And they put their whole racial effort into building a machine, one big machine. And Morbius takes the visitors to the planet down to show them the machine. It's still running, though it's not clear what it was exactly meant to do completely, though Morbius has his ideas. And he takes them down there and he says, look at this machine, 20 miles on a side, 20 miles, 20 miles, 20 miles down. The machine's churning away. And we learn eventually that the machine was designed to provide the whole civilization of the Krell with instant access to information, to organize information, to make it immediately available for any purpose. And the Krell were benign. There was no question about evil purposes with the Krell. And to let them move energy, convert energy to matter, and just do wonderful things. So the Krell, one day they turned on their machine, let the civilization, let their people use it, knowing that only wonders could come of it. And the machine destroyed their civilization in a single night, wiped it out, millions of years of evolution destroyed. And the machine did just what it was supposed to do. It followed the instructions it was given, but the Krell had kind of been a little too close to the problem in this film. They knew their technology and they knew that their goals were good, but in this case they'd sort of forgotten about their dark side, their subconscious. One in the film was called Monsters from the Id. And when they let the population loose at the machine, those other forces that they hadn't counted on destroyed them. Now, there's a couple of morals you can take away from a movie like that. I mean, one of them is that before you go into production, a little bit of extra beta testing can go a long way. But the other one is that just having your own motives be pure, just being sure of yourself and what you're doing and knowing that you're going to do it right isn't enough to protect you from those outside influences. And worse than that is that if you don't do it just right, if things go wrong, you become vulnerable to all kinds of really complex, non-technical forces that want to have their own way with these things. Some of those are just from society. You get knee-jerk reactions. People get upset about particular events, even if it's out of proportion. And they say, well, what are we going to do? They go to the politicians. They get the politicians involved. And believe me, you really don't want the politicians involved in these things. Because the definition of misunderstanding of technology in a lot of cases is the politicians, who are led by the nose, by the lobbyists, who push their own side of all of these issues. So the bottom line is that you have to be very proactive. If you're not, you may not get a second chance. And you have to remember that there are outside forces that may want to play the game differently than you do. And there's a perfect example now, of course, which is the whole big controversy that's blown up over the last few days over the feds going after your search records. Not just they're going after your search records, but maybe an even bigger part of the story is that the other search engines rolled over and turned over the search records. And there's a lot of arguing going on. Well, gee, that's not personal information. There's no IP addresses. The cookies aren't there. What harm are search records? What harm are keywords? And you guys know better than anyone that there's plenty of personal information in those search records. People tend not to think about these things. They put their own names in, their friends' names. They associate names with other names or with speculative concepts of what those names might be doing. They put in their phone numbers and their addresses, probably their social security numbers, which they shouldn't do, but people do it anyway. So as far as I'm concerned, when the government says there's no personal information in those search records, it's malarkey. It's the most polite word I can use for it. But that's how it's being spun. And so you have to kind of wonder, what's the next step with these kinds of things? You might lose this battle. And I fully support the Google position on this. I say 3 cheers. I'm glad you're fighting the action on this. I realize there are complicated reasons why it's being fought. It's all not just privacy, but there's major trade secret issues involved, undue burden issues. There's a lot of different reasons. But the bottom line is that you're fighting it. But again, you could lose, and you may have to turn it over in the end anyway. The next time the government comes back, they're probably going to want a lot more. The next time, they'll say, well, last time we didn't ask for the IP addresses. This time we want them. There's nothing in the law that says we can't have them. We want those cookies, too. We want to know everything from people that subscribe to your history service that keeps a more detailed history. We want to know about them also. And I say all this not knowing myself how often Google or the other search engines already have to turn over information in specific cases. And I'm sure it happens fairly frequently. Criminal investigations, maybe even national security letters, which are buried in a black hole. But it's really dangerous. It's dangerous not only for society when you lose the faith in the privacy of this kind of information, but it's also dangerous to you. It's dangerous to you financially. I got a call a couple of days ago from a friend of mine who'd seen me quoted in a couple of stories about this current situation. And he said, hey, Lauren, you got to hear this, what I heard at the swap meet I was just at. He said there were a couple of coin dealers. And he was standing there and he overheard these two coin dealers talking. And one of them said to the other one, hey, do you know where I can get information on the such and such gold coins from whatever it was? I said, oh, you can Google for that. Just go to Google and find out. The other coin dealer said, I don't know. I've been hearing stories now the government watches everything that's put into Google. Well, now, we know that's not true at the moment. But that's the perception that's being formed. And the perceptions can be at least as dangerous as the realities in these kinds of situations. And it could get a lot worse. If you look at what's happening at the European Union right now, they're starting to mandate all manner of data retention laws. They haven't really gone after search engines yet, but they'll think of that eventually. Right now, they're working on telecom data, cell record traffic, text messaging, things of that nature, I think. It's a growing, expanding cloud. And I think it's only a matter of time before the same kind of thing happens here. And it'll be put in the best possible light. I mean, there's going to be really good reasons for this that will be asserted. National security, of course, will be very popular. We live in a post-9/11 world. We're permanently at war with terror. Privacy is passé. Ironically, there's going to be a short-term battle over this because Congressman Markey just a couple of days ago announced that he's very dissatisfied with the fact that the government got hold of the search records and wants to get a law passed that would require that the search engines destroy personal data, however personal data is defined. There we go again, we're trying to define that, but destroy it within a, quote, reasonable period of time. So in the short run, we might get a law like that. But in the long run, the government is going to view these search engines as their personal piggy bank for information. And none of that means that we want to be soft on terrorism or soft on crime. It doesn't mean that. That's the way they'll try to shade it. But the difference is that when you start getting into wholesale dissemination of this kind of information, wholesale fishing expeditions, then what's happened is that little by little you chip away the civil liberties and the privacy issues. And sometimes they can just disappear so slowly that you don't realize it, and sometimes they can disappear very quickly. But in the end, you end up having taken on the attributes of those that you were fighting, and then you've lost. What's ironic in this case is that it's not even related to terrorism or anything like that. I mean, it's kind of interesting that the government chose a comparatively innocuous kind of case to bring this into the fray. My guess is they didn't think anyone would object. I mean, that's just my gut feeling that they really didn't expect anyone, particularly Google probably, to stand up to this. They said, well, the big guys, they're going to play along with us. They don't want to get in trouble with the government. But the way they're doing it with COPA, Child Online Protection Act, their argument is they need those records. And the most onerous part of it is that they want a week's worth of total keyword searches. The other parts are more random. And they said, we need this to prop up our case, basically. We need to prove that filtering is inefficient and that the kinds of remedies that are required by COPA, which basically requires adults to identify themselves, like with a credit card or some other nice instrument like that, before you can access objectionable material, material that's considered to be objectionable to children. So this becomes a situation where even though this seems like a comparatively innocuous case, you can see it as a harbinger for what's going to come, I think. And I'm not so sure that it can be stopped, but again, trying to be proactive on these things is very important. And keeping in mind that as much as technical people, I think we have a built-in bias to look for technical solutions. Natural enough, we try to figure out ways to solve the problem with better algorithms or better filters or other kinds of technical ways of approaching it. But the technology will only take you so far, because the forces out there that want to abuse what you've built and what you're doing could care less about a lot of that sort of thing. There's other areas, too, where the same kind of thing can happen. The search part of it is just one. Email is another place where we have to be very concerned about what the intentions are of those forces out there. A lot of people don't realize that the legal standards for the protection of people's email varies based on where that email is sitting physically. In general, the laws are such that you have much better protection from phishing expeditions of your email if you've got the email sitting on your own computer. If it's at a third-party site, like Gmail, for example, or Yahoo, or wherever, it's easier to get at from a legal standpoint. And if aspects of that email are linked in some way to searches, either through cookies or enhanced services or whatever, the probability of abuse of that kind of data gets even worse and worse. I don't want to be brazenly political about this. But I'm very concerned because I see what our government right now is willing to do. And in comparison with what we could get, this government is relatively benign. But we're still looking at controversies about things that I thought we'd never hear about from our government in my lifetime. Torture of prisoners, abuse of prisoners, warrantless wiretapping, all kinds of things that are being put out there with arguments that these are now necessary. And to my mind, that says, well, if you have a government that's willing to send people off to another country to be tortured, what are they going to do with the information that's in search engines and email and such? And I don't know for sure. I don't have any way to know what's going to happen, but I think it's worth thinking about, that all these things come together. The technological and non-technological aspects have to be viewed together. They have to be viewed as parts of the whole. And it's not just a matter of this country, because there are governments that are worse, much worse than what we have here. And yet the things that we're building and the systems that we're building and the work that we do can be used by them for their own forms of oppression, their own forms of evil. There's a lot of controversy about China now, which has essentially a draconian control over their internet. It's monitored, it's filtered. You can't use certain keyword searches. The search engines in general, and I believe Google, along with all the others, have cooperated in this, providing versions of their systems for the Chinese government to use for their very hierarchical, top-down internet environment to control what people are doing and to tip them off when things are happening that the government doesn't like. And this has real-world consequences. Yahoo has been involved in a situation where they turned over IP addresses that helped track down a dissident. Chinese consider him to be a criminal. We'd call it free speech, talking about a possible abuse by the Chinese government. Yahoo helped them track him down. He was tried, and now he's, I guess, rotting in a Chinese prison for 10 years. That's about as real as it gets. So, again, just saying, I won't do evil isn't really enough unless we're willing to accept those kinds of consequences from an ethical standpoint from countries like China. It's a horrible, slippery slope. And again, you still also run that risk of knee-jerk reactions and politicians getting involved, because if there's enough concern raised about this, you'll get politicians saying, well, you can't do business in China anymore. There's no telling what politicians will do. You can't predict. And there are arguments for staying in China, other than the obvious economic ones. You want those users, big chunk of them. There's an argument that says, well, we're better there than not there, because if we're not there, someone else will do it, or they'll do it themselves, and then they'll be in the same boat. So I'm not arguing that these are simple, or that there are answers that can be very easily introduced. And I'm not saying this is exclusive to Google or to Yahoo or many other services. There's services like the Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine and such, that have a whole different set of issues that are associated not only with real-time current state of the network, but with archives of material that can go way, way back. I think you can go to the Internet Archive, go to the Wayback Machine, and see some of the first Google home pages, which actually were not all that much different from the current one. Still kept very simple and very clean. But when you have that kind of information available as a resource, when it's stored and doesn't go away, there's a lot of bad things that can be done with it. And people can argue, well, physical libraries have always existed, in modern times anyway, and there's abuse that can be done with those too, with books, with physical records, and that's true. It is true, but one of the side effects of making information easily available, organizing it, making it just a fingertip punch away, is in a lot of cases it changes the data in a qualitative way. We started seeing this first with public record data. All the kinds of personal information that cities and counties and states have that traditionally were just on 3x5 index cards and file cabinets in some musty old closet in a county courthouse or something. And there weren't a lot of ways to abuse that data. It took too much work to get at it. Hard to aggregate, hard to process. But as the various municipalities started putting more and more of that data online, we started seeing the abuse start to occur. Because instead of having to go physically down there and go digging through index cards, you could just do a quick search and pull up 10 million records. There have been complaints about Google Earth. One of the most fantastic applications I've ever seen. Amazing thing. I'm like everyone else. When I first got that, I sat there and flew around the world and went, wow, this is really great, and zooming in and zooming out, and wow, there's my house, and all those wonderful things. And it can be argued, and it's true, that all the information in there is available from other places. You guys don't have satellites up there, I don't think, that are taking those pictures. You're just buying them from other sources, or you have arrangements to use them from other sources. But you make them so accessible in such a fantastic way that it worries some people. I'm not particularly concerned about that, but you have government screaming at you now that certain facilities are visible. And they don't really care that they're visible in other places too. What they care about is that it's on Google. I mean, that's one of the downsides of being the 800-pound gorilla. I mean, you set the pattern, and everybody looks to you both for the good and for the bad. You become a very easy target if you make any mistakes at all. And there's areas that are, of less import than people being thrown into prison for years, or some of these other concerns that have gotten a lot of attention, where again the influence that you have as such a major player, the major player in all of this, are indicating in various ways. Google, what was originally called Google Print for libraries, now I guess is excuse me, is under the Google Book Search label, has been very controversial because it's pushing the envelope when it comes to copyright law. And I've been generally on the side that says you guys are pushing that too hard, too fast. And there are publishers and other people who take the exact opposite view. That issue has cut the internet community down the middle. Normal cohorts who would normally agree on everything are on both sides of this one. Sometimes it depends on whether or not they've ever written a book. But Tim O'Reilly of O'Reilly Publications and I have had kind of a running public debate about this going for some time. And that's not to say that I don't think it would be wonderful to have all the books online. That'd be nifty.
You mind if I ask a question going back to the wiretapping?
Sure.
Privacy? That is, I see a disturbing trend towards erosion of people's expectation of privacy. That when the wiretapping story became public, it didn't really seem people have been outraged about it. And if people are not that outraged this time around, then next time around, maybe, again, people will not be outraged by it as our privacy is eroded further. What ways do you think average people could, turn that expectation of privacy in the other direction, so that average Americans expect more privacy, demand more privacy?
The question really boils down to reverse the trend where people don't expect privacy and are willing to make do with less or none. Fair?
Yeah.
I'm not sure you can succeed in doing it. I think the way you have to try to do it is by leading in these areas. This is where the kind of power you have, both financially and in terms of technology, is so important. To go beyond, like I was saying earlier, going beyond not doing evil yourselves, but doing what you can to try to prevent other evils, to provide an example that is some degree, as far as possible, ahead of the rest. Because there's, as I was saying, there are forces that are putting all of this in political terms, in terrorism terms, and I'm not saying that what they're talking about has no validity, but I'm saying that it's often very skewed. I mean, that's how politics works all through history. You take someone else's concepts or someone else's work and you will attempt to spin it in your own direction. So I guess the simple answer to your question is you have to really push the envelope, not only in terms of technology, but in terms of these kinds of issues involving privacy and things, going beyond what seems to be enough to cover your own behinds, for example, or today's technology, but to really show that you want to go the extra mile, even if that means giving up some capabilities that you'd like to have, even if that means, for example, that you have to give up all of the technical benefits of having massive amounts of data available to work with. There's always going to be a trade-off in those sorts of things. It's all trade-offs. Anyone who tells you this is all on one side or on the other side isn't telling the truth. That was like it's the same I was saying about Google Book Search. It's the same kind of thing. You can get people on both sides who will say, well, this fits within copyright law, this doesn't fit. You'll get authors who say, Google didn't ask me for permission, I've hardly sold any books ever. Every book that's just copied or scanned without paying me is money out of my pocket. How come Google didn't ask my permission? And so, well, they don't have to ask your permission. And and it's a very complicated area that'll be decided in the courts. And when you push the envelope on these things, and laws are always based on pushing the envelope, changes in the laws, copyright law and patent law, and trying to take advantage of new technologies. But you can't always predict the outcomes, though. I mean, if you look at patent law, for example, it can show you how just crazy things can get, where you have patents now being assigned for trivial, obvious sorts of things, for algorithms, to the extent that now it's gotten to the point where some companies, when they want to try to do a new piece of software, they got to spend a fortune doing patent searches to figure out if somebody has a patent on left shift or something. Or there's actually a patent out there on using a laser pointer to play with a cat.
Not only one, it's actually 4 or 5.
So the same. We run the risk of the same sort of thing happening with copyright, and I think part of what has caused concerns, from my standpoint anyway, with the attitude, with parts of the attitude with the book search project, Google Book Search, is I worry about what it says to other people who figure that they have permission to copy anything they want. I mean, if Google can do it for an index, and I understand all the arguments, this is an index, you're not making the full books available. I mean, there's a lot of detail in the product. But other people look at this and say, well, I can do the same thing. I can set up an index on my home computer. I can just scan this book. And it's difficult because using some of the analogies that we have, and it's not just, again, with Google Book Search, but when you move into these new areas, a lot of the analogies that we have to work with are imperfect. So we're talking about online indexes in a form that never existed before. And yet we know that, as far as I know anyway, there are no libraries that built their card indexes on copies of books that were Xeroxed for free from other libraries. They all paid for those books at least once. So when you try to dig backward and try to draw these comparisons in terms of what's right and what's wrong in these areas, it gets very, very difficult. And then there's forces that purposely try to obscure these matters and try to make it as complicated as possible for their own ends. And good examples of that are some of the things going on now with the RIAA and the MPAA, involving audio and film piracy, music and film piracy. And they have a real problem. Piracy is a real problem. It threatens their industries. Some of them are probably looking at the Google Video project and trying to decide whether they want to love it or hate it. They haven't made up their mind yet, clearly. A lot of them are buying in, and others are kind of sitting there, probably sweating, all day long. And they have, and the RIAA and the MPAA and the organizations that they represent, the music labels and the studios, I have friends in both of those industries who tell me stories about how much they're concerned and how much they've lost. And I have a lot of sympathy. But what happens when they start to use those concerns to obstruct other uses that are legitimate, or to obstruct innovation in ways that could have completely unforeseen consequences? And that's really what they've been trying to do. First, it was attacks on file sharing and P2P networks, basically trying to shade those as all illegal. Anyone running file sharing must be a pirate. Now they're very actively at this moment pushing new legislation for just a Frankensteinian kind of content control. Goes way beyond the old broadcast flag proposals for digital TV. Now they want to build all kinds of mechanisms into every consumer product to control content across generations. They want to close the so-called analog hole, which is a sort of the last thing people can do in terms of getting material in that's not completely under some kind of dictatorial control. There were even proposals to try to modify basic hardware, like building restrictions into A to D converters. We're talking about the building blocks of all this technology and building restrictions into that. And those guys have lobbyists. We know about lobbyists now. So you can see how, again, those kinds of forces who might show up one day at your front office up at the Googleplex and say, hey, we want to make a deal with you. What they're going to do the next month or the next year, talking to their friends, the politicians, there's no telling where you're going to end up. There's demands to control and demands to filter and greed, all of these things. While we're on the topic of stifling innovation and greed and control and such, it's impossible to ignore our good friends, the ISPs, who have now kind of moved into the light with attitudes that I think a lot of us sort of knew were there all along. And this applies mostly to the phone companies now, though the cable companies and the wireless ones and everybody else, they're watching, they're waiting, they're biding their time. But the ISPs have never really been happy with the internet. It's not their kind of product. It's not their kind of system. They want control. They want to sell the applications. They want to control the applications. The end-to-end nature of the internet, based on the end-to-end nature of the ARPANET from so many years ago, is absolutely 180 degrees away from their model. And they think they've found a way now to deal with that and to start moving things in the direction that they want, toward what we call walled gardens, where it becomes difficult or impossible or expensive for consumers to get it information that isn't controlled by the ISP. And there's various layers to this, but the handwriting went on the wall when some of the heads of these companies started saying things like, and I'm paraphrasing, why the hell does Google get away with using my pipes for free? I mean, the fact that their subscribers are already paying for DSL or for cable service or whatever isn't really the issue, but Google isn't paying us. In other words, they want a piece of the action. They want a piece of your action. And in the real world outside technology, there are terms for some of the threats that they've been making. And the way they're putting it is they're phrasing it very carefully. They put it in terms of, for example, enhanced services. In other words, Google or whatever service provider is going to have to pay some extra to get high-speed access to that ISP's customers. Of course, the ISP will decide what high-speed means. Perhaps web browsing only needs a 300 bit per second connection. Beyond that, it's an enhanced service. Pay up. And they have arguments. They have arguments. They've spent a fortune on fiber, and they'll find various ways to put this in terms that seem positive to them. But the bottom line is that they want control. Sometimes they've even done this. They've tried to bring up the kinds of lofty motives about stopping spam, of course. And there have been ways they've done this before. The kind of port blocking that goes on by ISPs is a good example. And what they do is they'll typically say, well, we block port 25, that's where the mail tends to flow normally, because that helps prevent spam. We don't want consumers running their own servers. And if you look at the ISP consumer agreements, they usually say you can't run any servers. But if you can't run your own servers, the implications of that for privacy and security are pretty spectacular, because then you have all that information flowing usually in the clear, at least at some point, because the headers and things have to be handled by the ISPs through those central servers. And we've now seen the handwriting on the wall of how safe those central servers are going to be from various kinds of attack and abuse. Yeah?
So in the case of ISPs, I mean, this is, there's some, I can think of some ins and outs, but basically I can, the straw man question I'll ask is this not something that the market can settle itself, basically by pitting, you know, an ISP who wants to give you normal crappy service for a certain amount against a different ISP who says, okay, our contract says we'll give we'll honor the old agreements and give everybody equally good service without paying any extra. Now the argument I can see against that is that ultimately you get down to community control over what gets wired to the house, and that's probably the lever that the phone companies and the cable companies are going to use to try to continue to push their agenda. But yeah, nevertheless, you know, do you see a possibility of being able to just kill these guys at their own, you know, using to use the hacky phrase, using the free market to squeeze their juice out like a grain?
To paraphrase the question, it really is there a way to fight the ISPs on this? Is there a way through the marketplace, in particular, to prevent that kind of stranglehold? I doubt it. It's not clear how to do it right now. Part of the reason is that at one time there were a lot more ISPs than there are now. The marketplace has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and the laws that play into this have been basically moved almost totally in the ISP's direction. Some of the competition that existed before doesn't exist now. A lot of the competitors that do exist are piggybacked on the incumbent carriers' services, and now it's not clear that they even have to keep providing that underlying mechanism. Plus you have this issue that you know, they have the lobbyists and they have the excuses that they make about security and privacy, and you know, there are some people who think, well, we can solve all this with wireless neighborhood networks, for example, Wi-Fi, public Wi-Fi, but they have to connect to the internet somewhere, and that's where the choke points are. And unless there's a real serious sea change in the way things have been going, which would have to be completely different from the way all the forces are moving now, I don't see how you can effectively fight the ISPs on the technical level. If there's a way to convince the politicians and to tell them, through them, to say, this is something we won't put up with, then you have a chance. If you could, theoretically, get enough consumers really concerned about this, you might be able to have some impact, but that's very academic. Because the big carriers have control over the flow of information, and it's very hard to reach those consumers and explain these issues to them. There's so much propaganda. And it takes special skills to be able to do that kind of marketing and a lot of money. Maybe that's the kind of money that organizations like Google could help provide to do these kinds of fights, but they're big battles. And when I look at the future on this, I say openly, I'm not optimistic about it. Now, that doesn't mean you don't want to do the fighting. It doesn't mean the battles aren't worthwhile. Peter Neumann of SRI was the second site on the ARPANET, and Dave Farber, who was former FCC chief scientist, he's at Carnegie Mellon now, and myself, very recently, just a few weeks ago, formed an organization called IOIC. It's the International Open Internet Coalition. It's at IOIC.net. Not much there right now, really, just a statement of purpose. To try to form a focal point, to try to find a way for services that are concerned about losing these end-to-end capabilities, network neutrality issues, all these sorts of things, to try to find a way for them to get together to fight these kinds of battles, or at least to bring sense and information to the mix. because they are complicated issues. But like I was saying, it's not clear that you can win, but you have to try with these sorts of things. And we're hoping IOIC can help. And you never know. Sometimes you get lucky with these things. Sometimes things go in the right direction. The future's never completely determined. There are other things that play into all of these issues also. It just gets so enmeshed. Much broader issues of internet governance that I won't really get into now, because I mean that's a whole nother 2 or 3 talks, except just to touch the key point, which is that nobody really understands how to manage the internet. The technology is such, and a lot of people don't realize this who are non-technical, that people can run off with it in any direction they want to, really. And all that's really held it together to a certain point, to a certain extent, is inertia. There's a lot of concern about ICANN. And I have a lot of respect for the people at ICANN. But their policies have caused a lot of problems in terms of the directions they've taken, and the procedures they use to set those policies have been very controversial and highly mutable, let's say. So there's a lot of questions about should ICANN have the role it has, limited to the extent that it is, and what about all the issues that ICANN doesn't handle? And the rest of the world isn't waiting. The US wants to maintain control of the internet. And this usually tends to be put in terms of domain names. You know, are we going to get this domain name or this one? Is there going to be a .xxx? All these kinds of things. But I think that's really sort of a sideshow. When you look at the broader issues of control and access and civil liberties and freedom of speech and all those things that the internet is now absolutely vital to in so many ways. And the rest of the world's going off in their own direction anyway. We're starting to see countries that are just sort of fed up with the current modality of ICANN and the internet saying, well, we're not going to wait around anymore. We're going to build our own system. We're going to have our own domain names. Maybe it'll be fully compatible with the existing internet. Maybe it won't. The real problem there is you can end up with network fragmentation. Then it's not an internet anymore by definition, really. And then we've lost the wonders of our own great machine, in a way. Because all this work that's gone on over these decades has been sort of predicated on the view that it should be open and neutral, that people should be able to control the processes, and that may have been a very idealistic view. Domestic governments will always have the ultimate say. Some people say, well, we need the UN to take control. Well, please, give me a break. It's probably true that we need different kinds of organizations to control things, but we don't need an organization coming into focus to control these things that has that kind of baggage. But if we're not careful, that kind of thing could happen by default, because there are a lot of signs now that these issues are reaching such a point that they're just going to go off in their own direction, flying off in pieces no matter what. So, like, where do we go from here? I mean, what do you do? And I mean, I can't predict the future, and I don't have the answers. I'm not coming here to say I have this set of mystical procedures you can follow that'll fix all this. My crystal ball's cracked and burned and frayed as much as anyone else's. And these are really tough problems. And because they transcend technology, because they involve so much of society and politics and all these other things, it makes them all the tougher. But I think that the hope in this is to try to approach these problems in the same way that tends to work best with all human endeavors. And that is with as open a mind as possible, in as multidisciplinary a way as possible. Don't depend too much on the technology. That's obviously at the heart, but it's easy to be seduced into thinking that's the only way. To bring in as much input from other sources as you can to try to play into these issues, both at the corporate level and more broadly. And that can be done through employees, it can be done through outside advisory panels, combinations of those things. But I think that's the only way to move forward and minimize the kind of knee-jerk reactions that can be very damaging, and to enhance your own prospects. I mean, not only from a financial standpoint in the long run, but also those intangibles, those ethical questions and international questions and all these things that have become so cloudy now and become so much a part of the world outside of the technical universe. And it's also important that these things not only be done in an open and honest way. If you just say it, that's no good. But it has to also be seen to be that way. It has to be so obvious that no one can misunderstand the motives or what's going on. It has to be genuine. Because again, the perceptions can be more important than the reality. So in the end, in the final analysis, sort of where we started, it's just not enough to say, don't do evil. You really want, if you can, to go to the next steps and try to find ways to prevent evil and to prevent others from doing evils with the marvels that you've created and the wonderful products that you've created. And this goes for all the other companies too, that they're doing these kinds of things. And trying to get rid of evil is a very serious challenge, very difficult. Technologists throughout history for thousands of years have seen what has happened to their tools in the wrong hands or when they were abused, and how difficult it is to control it. And more often than not, they fail in controlling it. But I think it's still a challenge that's worthwhile. And I think that if we put our hearts into it, and if we try to work on these things together in an honest way, I think it's still worth a try. And you never know. Sometimes you win, sometimes you succeed. Thanks again for inviting me. Any other questions, comments, suggestions? Yeah, sure. I'm running a little over. I hope that's okay.
We'll just see how many questions there are.
Okay.
Back when the internet was first being designed, you said some things could have been changed to make some things that are now problems not be. What should have been done with the benefit of the crystal ball of this hindsight?
The question is, what could we have done differently in the early internet, and by extension the ARPANET, that could have helped some of the problems we have now? Well, clearly there was a whole issue of security that was not really considered. This is kind of ironic because many of these projects were really security-related projects at the local sites involving secure operating system kernels and things like that. But it didn't seem that important for the ARPANET itself. It's important to remember, and this is kind of lost in history, that so much of the ARPANET just flowed directly into the internet. The protocols changed at one point. In the early days, it was a protocol called NCP, and then it became TCP/IP. But from the standpoint of someone who was there almost the entire period, looking at it, they'd say, well, it seems to have been a smooth transition. We should have, for example, have built in some kind of encryption, even though we didn't really have the kinds of algorithms that we really would have needed to do this in a good way back then. There was no, public key crypto systems and things were not available in that kind of form. But we could have done better in terms of building at least some kind of baseline encryption into the network. For sure, the issue of authentication is one that could have been handled very differently. The whole issue of spam now in a lot of ways revolves around authentication. Now but it's still a very difficult problem because you don't want to build a police state internet either. Well, at least most of us don't. And that's easy to do with authentication if you're not very careful. And there's, as I was discussing earlier, there's states now that, there's countries now that are very much in that kind of modality. Because the whole issue of free speech is buried in this, and more than that, there are countries now where the internet represents the only way for dissidents to speak out against oppressive governments. And if they could be tracked with 100% certainty, that would have very serious repercussions. On the other hand, people will say, well, you want to be able to track that terrorist using the internet. So these are tough, tough problems. And before you can even address them from a technical standpoint, from a technological standpoint, you have to figure out the basis of the policy that you want to work with. And that's part of the reason that just one of many reasons that some of these weren't addressed way back when, because those weren't the policies we were dealing with. We were just trying to get the bits to move. We were dealing with modems the size of refrigerators. The backbone of the internet was 56 kilobits a second. So there were sort of hardcore, low-level technical issues we were dealing with, and it was only over time that these kinds of issues became more obvious as the internet became more and more a part of the real world. But encryption is one, authentication is another. There are reliability issues. Some of it's always, 20/20 hindsight's easy. We had some spectacular crashes of the ARPANET. We learned a lot from those. Race conditions among the IMPs. The IMPs were the refrigerator-sized routers we had back then. Bring the whole internet down. There was an early hack attack by the son of a major cryptography person who was at NSA at the time, who let loose what we would call a virus now. Actually, it was a worm, technically, that went spinning around and causing problems in the early days. And it was more.